President of the National Right to Work Committee. Mark, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Good to be on with you.
Mark, there's a big controversy now with regard to the National Right to Work Committee opposing H.R. 2474, the so-called PRO Act, which, as you say, would wipe out all 27 state right to work laws, let big labor organize unions without a secret ballot vote, and impose a laundry list of other union boss power grabs. Talk a little bit about what this bill is and what it's going to mean to workers.
Yeah, this is a really amazing piece of legislation. It's basically the culmination of everything that organized labor officials have asked the U.S. Congress to do over the last 20 or 30 years, all wrapped into one package that amazingly passed the House of Representatives on February 6 with 224 votes. From our perspective, the most onerous part of the bill, and all of it's onerous, but the one part that we are most concerned about is the bill would simply eliminate the 27 right to work laws that have been passed around the country, 5 in the last 8 years, that simply protect a worker's right to choose whether or not to financially support a labor union as a condition of getting or keeping a job. You know, the simplicity of right to work is that it gives individual employees the choice to decide whether or not they want to financially affiliate with a labor union. We think that's good policy. Apparently, Nancy Pelosi and her caucus believe that they got to change that under federal law and reimpose compulsory unionism across the entire country, like they did in 1935 when Franklin Roosevelt imposed forced unionism on the nation.
Now, when you say forced unionism, we're talking public or private or both?
We're talking the private sector here. The National Labor Relations Act, which was passed in the first part of it passed in 1935, established this federal labor policy that imposes this on private sector employees across the country. There are very minor exceptions to the act, but basically, if you're an agricultural worker or if you're in a company that has less than, I think it's $50,000 in revenue, you are covered by the National Labor Relations Act in the private sector. Public sector workers are covered by state law in most instances. And the good news there, Chuck, is that we were able to win a Supreme Court decision back in 2018 that protected every government employee across the country from being forced to pay dues or fees as a condition of getting or keeping a job with their government. The case was called Janus v. AFSCME, and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation represented Mark Janus in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that year.
Right, and I think it also was an issue that came to the public attention due to the work of Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, who, when he was successful in opposing the state public unions, exposed the corruption that was involved in that. That once they got rid of the mandatory element of public unionism, people were able to get actually cheaper health insurance and cheaper benefits because municipalities could then go to compete rather than go to just the one corrupt outfit that was put forth by this monopoly public sector entity. That was busted. And I think that benefited public sector workers. But what we're talking about here is private companies, big companies that have unions. In essence, all workers will be forced to pay union dues and will get, whether they're in a union or not, and will be put under the strictures of unions. If this law passes.
Yeah, that's basically what they're up to. If you're in a unionized shop and the unions negotiate what's called a union security clause, which they always do, because the union security clause is just that. It's security for the union officials because it basically tells the employer, they sit down with the employer and say, look, we'll take a 5% pay raise, or you can force all your employees to pay us a fee for the privilege of working for you. And as an employer, they look at it and say, let's do the union security route. And 3 years later, you'll get the other thing. But initially, if the unions can get union security, meaning forced payment of fees, and a dues checkoff where the employer takes the money out of an employee's paycheck, that's pretty easy to agree to in a union negotiating situation. So if this bill passed, then first of all 27 right to work laws would be wiped out. And then these union security clauses could be negotiated. And if they're negotiated, then workers would simply be fired if they didn't pay the fees that the union required of them.
Now, Mark, just illustrate in a nutshell, what are the right to work laws as they stand? And are they different in each state?
No, they're relatively the same. I mean, the language may look different, but the principle and the purpose of a right to work law in every state that has them is, one, to protect individual workers from union compulsion, Two, protect individual workers' rights to join unions. I mean, that's one of the things union officials never talk about, is that states that have right to work laws have a union density in some states that's higher than states that don't have right to work laws. And union density there is actually increasing in 16 of the 27 right to work states in 2019. Union membership actually increased. Now, why is that? Because union officials now know that they have to sell a product. They have to go out and provide a service to workers in order to get them to join and pay fees. You know, the secret to unionization and the union revenue is money. Their dues are their revenue. And so if they're not convincing workers to join them voluntarily, then they're not going to get their money. So, you know, in states that have right to work laws, what we find is union officials are much more accountable. They get out of the political game for the most part, and they start focusing on the shop floor and convincing workers to join them voluntarily.
Right. I mean, the competition makes it a much better situation for workers. And I mean, I was in both a union and a non-union hotel when I was in the hotel business many, many years ago. And I noticed that the non-union hotel had better benefits than the union hotel because they wanted to keep the union out. And so you have this sort of balance. And by the way, I much preferred non-union anyway, for a lot of reasons I could get into. But the point is that to have the union face competition from non-union workers forces both sides to improve benefits and the rights of workers. And to give the unions a monopoly in a state, that's not going to be good for workers. I mean, let alone that's going to help the guys with the pinky rings, you know, the heads of the unions, not your rank and file.
Yeah, and that's what we found, Chuck. The foundation represents literally thousands of employees every year. We provide free legal aid to those employees, and every one of them has a story. And these stories, some of them are horrifying, others are just simply disagreements with the political ideology or the philosophical ideology of the union officials that have control over their voice in the workplace because of this compulsory unionism privilege. But every worker has a story, and it's not up to government to decide that this is best for you or this is best for them. We ought to give workers the choice to do that. And Nancy Pelosi and her caucus in the United States Congress talk about choice, individual choice, all the time on certain issues.
Yes,
but when it comes to compulsory unionism, they want every worker to sit down, shut up, and take the word of union bosses as to what's best for them. That doesn't make any sense.
The other thing you touched on is the fact that unions, particularly private unions openly, public unions covertly, are very involved in political causes. And oftentimes these causes not only are not consonant with the rank and file, but they're actually in opposition to the interests of workers. Like, for example, open borders and open immigration. That's not going to help labor. That's going to hurt labor. That's going to hurt the benefits that labor has achieved in this country going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century by bringing in cheap labor. And also lots of whole cornucopia of left-wing causes like abortion and gay rights and all the rest that have nothing to do with labor. In a way, by making the labor union compete, it makes them focus on the actual function of their enterprise, which is to help workers, not get involved in, ancillary political issues that may or may not, and often not, reflect the values of the rank and file.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the chasm between union officials on one hand and rank and file workers on the other is growing wider and wider because union officials have basically made an all-in bet on one political party. And that political party comes with these views that are antithetical in many instances to private sector workers. I mean, how the Operating Engineers Union allows the AFL-CIO to spend money on, so-called environmental issues is really an interesting idea. Rank and file workers across the country in the 2016 election in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, in Ohio and Pennsylvania, they're the ones that put President Trump in the White House. I mean, the fact is their union officials spent boatloads of money on the other side trying to convince the American people that this idea of kind of democratic socialism, which they are openly calling it now, at least in Bernie Sanders' case, yes, and others, and union officials like Richard Trumka and John Sweeney, the former president of the AFL-CIO, who said, I'm a proud card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, that's antithetical, to your point, to most rank-and-file workers in the private sector.
Absolutely. And also John Sweeney was quoted in the last election as saying that, admitting that most of his rank-and-file people were supporting Trump. So, right. I mean, it's but it's a very different universe. The kind of the heads of the unions, the guys I like to call the guys of the pinky rings, and the rank and file workers who are actually working and who have a different set of interests. So there was a byproduct of the business with Scott Walker in Wisconsin when he took on the public unions, that people in public unions who object to the politics of their union have a right to withhold a portion of their dues so that it doesn't go to these political activities. What is the present status of that?
Yeah, well, I think the irony of the whole Wisconsin Scott Walker battle was that Wisconsin was the first state to implement statewide government sector bargaining for state employees and local government employees in their state. And ironically, it was the state that said, we need to get out of this structure. And Scott Walker did that. They didn't eliminate bargaining in its entirety. They simply limited it to wage negotiation and other, and we'll see what happens if they add back on other conditions of employment. But it was a very important battle in the idea of who controls government, taxpayers or union officials, because what was granted in Wisconsin back in 1959 was a monopoly to union officials to speak on behalf of government employees and be the sole voice in the marketplace. And then, to add insult to injury, they used this power to collect more money from public sector workers, which they in turn around and use to elect politicians that they're negotiating with on the other side of the table. So it got to be so bad that something had to be done. And if you talk to people in Wisconsin now, they'll say things are much better, because even the city of Milwaukee, I think it was the executive council of the city of Milwaukee, said, yeah, well, we thought it was going to be bad, but we have a little more control over our government now. As far as the political expenditures for public employees, as I mentioned, we won a Supreme Court case called Janus v. AFSCME on June 27th of 2018 that protects every government worker across the entire country from being forced to pay fees to keep their jobs or work for government. So no government worker in the public sector can be forced to pay fees anymore. We actually got the Supreme Court to agree that this was a violation of workers' First Amendment rights. So it became a constitutional question, and now that constitutional principle, the First Amendment protections, expanded entirely across the country. So we have what would be similar to a national right to work law for every government employee in America.
Plus, it's a conflict of interest to have public unions collective bargaining. As you say, they're going to take the monies that they get and they're going to help in one way or another candidates who support their position, which means bigger, more money. Expanding government responsibility, which means liberal left government. And that's a conflict of interest for the taxpayer and for the citizen. To have public sector employees who are working as public servants have, their organization promoting particular candidates, either in the de facto sense or indirectly. And so, that's a kind of a corruption that really has to stop.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. It's now overtly admitted by union officials, for example, in California, that stand up in legislative sessions and committee hearings saying it's pretty cool that we get to elect our own bosses. That's a paraphrase, but you get the point. It really is interesting that we've granted a monopoly to a monopoly in states that recognize union officials as a voice for public employees. In fact, we're dealing with a bill right now in Virginia today, this afternoon, a bill that would impose bargaining in the Commonwealth of Virginia. When other states are looking to get out and roll back union monopoly power, you have a state like Virginia now that's trying to impose it on the taxpayers, and we know that's not good policy. Virginia's been ranked one of the most fiscally sound states over the last 20 years, and one of the reasons is the flexibility of elected officials to basically, deal with situations that come up, like the 2007-2008 recession, when then Governor Tim Kaine was able to work the budget to save about $198 million and create a stability in the Virginia government that other states like Illinois and New York and California and Massachusetts and New Jersey, those states that are now suffering under promises made to union officials and union officials negotiated promises to public employees that unfortunately are not going to be fulfilled. Think about the pension issue and the problems that many of these states have. That's a function of this monopoly power that union officials have had. They say, oh, we promise you the best pension ever. Well, at some point, someone's got to pay for that. And in states like Illinois and California, now Ohio has that problem, in New Jersey, no one's capable of paying that liability that exists now in those states. It's really unfortunate for the public sector workers who did their job. But now
right, of course, it's their money. It's
Yeah.
their money, and the whole thing looks like it'll implode in the next 10 years or so.